Welcome to Strain on the Game, the podcast that reveals what it really takes to keep elite footballers performing at the highest level. I'm Stephen Warnock, former Premier League player, joined by physical performance expert Adrian Lamb. From training ground truths to the financial impact of fitness, we discuss the often overlooked challenges behind the beautiful game. One of the big things I struggled on with certainly recovering was sleep after a game. And I think sleep is arguably the one thing that most players struggle with. And especially now when we're looking at kickoff times and you've got an 8 p.m. kickoff and you're asked to sleep that night, but then be in the next day for recovery sessions if you've got a midweek game or you've got a weekend game coming after a midweek kickoff. How difficult is it for why is it so difficult for players to get to sleep after a game?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a number of factors, but I think like that kind of, particularly if you're playing in the evening, you might have been taking caffeine as well. So caffeine's one of the factors that can delay falling to sleep.
Yeah.
Also just that excitation, that, again, nervous system excitation from playing a game, you got the psychological component, the physical component. You might also have structural damage at the tissue level. So there's a lot going on, and between those factors, it seems that's a key issue with players, particularly being able to fall asleep. I think that's been a key thing. And from our perspective, we would profile the players from a chronotype perspective. So when I say a chronotype, it's basically, are you a night owl or a morning lark type of person? It seems that it's either one or the other. There's also like an intermediate in the middle as well. But that would give us information of maybe who to target for recovery strategies post-game. And a good example for us with this was around European away games. So historically, we'd always, if we played in Europe, we'd travel straight away back. You'd always get back at 4 a.m. And then, like you said, Stephen, you'd be in the training ground at 9 a.m. And then it was like, no one even batted an eyelid then. And I think it's interesting now where there's a lot more awareness around sleep, just for general population. It's like, Jesus, how did we get away with doing that for so long?
Yeah.
But we actually, when we play, so this is something that actually I'm working on at the moment. We were quite lucky. So there was there was 5 airports we weren't allowed to fly out of right after the game. So we had to stay over. So it was good because then we could compare, how are the players responding from a recovery and sleep perspective when we fly straight away back, get back at 4 a.m. or stay over and then fly mid-morning the next day. And what we found was that actually it was the second day after, when we'd stayed over, so we were back in the UK, in Manchester, there was a big improvement in terms of sleep quality compared to if we flew home straight away. So it seemed it wasn't that initial night. It seemed it was like the nights after. So that was a good kind of random situation, which was able for us to say to management, listen, we should probably stay over from now on. We're seeing to have a big improvement, but when we would stay over, there'd be players who always would report they can't fall asleep. And then we'd have players who would report they can't stay asleep. So at this point in time, for the players who couldn't fall asleep, I was available to do a recovery session in the hotel to kind of start that more physiological process. And then the ones who couldn't stay asleep, I was also available very early the next morning to also do a recovery session there. Plus, we were back at the hotel, so you had optimal feeding opportunities, so it was better than plain food. And we at least were giving the players like a 10-hour window to sleep if they could. I think it's a really interesting one because you ask players and staff and they're like, they just want to get home. They want to try to get back as soon as possible. So it was a kind of a delicate situation to manage where you've got something that we know from some of the data that actually it's probably best staying over. I know you don't like it, but how do you then communicate that? And so that was I think a good example of the impact of sleep. But I think there's things we can do now that can indirectly improve the chances of falling asleep and staying asleep. So even like ice baths and cold water immersions been used for years and years, mainly for muscle damage. But you're also likely going to get a potentially higher probability of increasing your sleep quality that night as well. So I think there's things we can also do to indirectly affect sleep now, which is positive. And it's not just, oh, well, I can't. I mean, one thing that I had to really kind of get my head around and have a bit of empathy with players was around, they'd always say, oh, I can't sleep. I'm never going to sleep after a game. And just trying to understand where they're coming from, but also provide them options for them just to get that opportunity too. And some may work, some may not. But I think that's certainly an individualized approach. So yeah,
there's a lot more awareness around sleep in the general population. Just kind of very briefly, can you just explain the importance of sleep and what role it plays in the recovery process?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we sleep, that's when you're going to get the majority of the recovery properties from a physiological and muscular perspective. But that's also when you consolidate memory and also learning. So even if you're going through in football, like technical, tactical situations, it's also having optimal sleep is also going to benefit like the consolidation of that new information. So yeah, from both physical and mental perspective, it's imperative. And I think we always sort of treat it as a given. And now, like you say, Lammy, there's more of an appreciation. But I still think we kind of just say, yeah, optimal sleep's great. You need to get your sleep great. I don't think we do a good job of really helping players to really sort of construct a framework for themselves and get that kind of nighttime routine. We always talk about morning routines. Like, what is a nighttime routine for players to go through to prioritize that sleep?
Sure. So what could you do?
Well, so I mean, I think first of all, profile the player. What type of chronotype and sleeper are they? Understand where they have issues. I think the first thing is like the environment. Like, what is the sleeping environment they're in, and that also family, partners, etc. We know it's got to be dark. It's got to be cool. It's like, funnily enough, it's got to be tidy. That has an impact on how well you sleep as well. Sound, ensuring that there's some of the obvious things, but some of the obvious things, I think, particularly for football players as well, like they're not always thinking about. And then there's certain temperature-based things you can do. So when you fall asleep, you have this like reduction in temperature, so your body cools. So you can also have a hot shower or a hot bath in the hour or so before you plan to sleep. And that just facilitates coming down from a heated temperature, so your body cools and so you're more likely to fall asleep. In the day, you can use cold water, and that sort of stimulates this kind of higher parasympathetic state, this sort of nervous system activity to give you the best probability of sleeping. But there's also really like nuance factors. I remember like in a Premier League squad now, you've got a lot of South American players, a lot of players from different cultural backgrounds.
Yeah.
So what we did, this was probably 11 years ago, we gave players like sleep trackers on the wrist, which everyone wears now anyway, but they didn't then. So each player would wear it for 2 weeks during the season, and that had to include a weekend game that wasn't a night game, and then obviously a period of training. So we were able to compare, like, generally of a weekend Premier League game, what sleep like the day before a game and the day after a game. And we found that the day after, some players could sleep really well, but some players, like, it was really bad, which gave that indication that's very individualized. But we had players who would be watching Brazilian football till 4 or 5 a.m. and it was and it was a social issue. So I remember one player, and like we'd signed him, and he'd come into the training ground and like bloodshot eyes every morning, and we're like Jesus, is like we obviously the British mentality is someone going out here every night and enjoying it.
Yeah.
But it was just like understanding from a cultural perspective, these players are used to going to bed really, really late, and some of them are also wanting to watch their football that from the country they've come from, so the time difference just didn't allow them to. So of that period that I just spoke about where we measured the sleep, this player in on average for 2 weeks was going to bed at nearly 4 a.m. every night. And back then you had to be in training at 9. So going on the topic of why or how sleep is really important for players, like I think in the squads now, you got to have to understand that there's going to be some cultural background differences to accommodate for. And so does that mean putting training back into the afternoon, which a lot of managers and coaches like to do, or yeah?
I was going to ask that question about the training times now. So training times now have adapted to game time, haven't they? And changing. Is that to do with the recovery process as well, or is it just adapting the body to that time zone or time ready to play the games?
Yeah, I think one coach that we had, it was only the day before the game we would train at kickoff time. So it was more around like just getting the body and the mind accustomed to this is when we're going to play, this is when we're going to train, the nearest game, or the nearest training session to the game. So from that perspective, it wasn't about recovery. It was more because in reality, you're having less recovery. And that was actually one of the things that was raised, not to question that process, but to ask a question around, is this something to look at? If we do that, if you say the norm in the UK and the Premier League is 10 a.m., 10:30 training, and then you go now, you got an 8 o'clock game and you train at 8, you've then lost 10 hours. So
yeah,
that's not about recovery at all. It's more about getting the players mentally. And to be honest, that's the great thing about, I think, bringing all these interdisciplinary practitioners together. Like, it's not like maybe if the periodization's right in the week, then recovering match day -1 to match day, is that really a big factor, or should it be, you know what, no, let's get the players mentally ready to play at that time of day? And that might be related to light time, about floodlights, all those types of things. So, yeah, I think in a good group of staff, that's a great discussion to have.
Yeah. But go on, I mean, I know you were going to ask something.
I just wanted to sort of touch on, you mentioned the amount of European games that you were involved with when you were at Manchester United. How big an impact does travel have on players, and how do you facilitate recovery from that, if indeed it does have a significant effect?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And it's in the purest term, like travel fatigue, and then you've got jet lag. Is like they're two different things as well, massively, because I think we're actually a bit more fortunate in Europe where we're not crossing different time zones as they would be in US sports like the NBA and NFL, etc. Like, I think for the time at Manchester United in the Premier League, it wasn't an issue. As well, with getting around the country's not a problem. I think as soon as you start traveling to maybe Russia and like the Ukraine, Turkeys of the world, then you're starting to deal with a couple of time zone differences. You're then going to be getting back later. So one of the big things for us was what we've discussed around, like, let's stay over and not almost like exacerbate those issues by returning straight away. So I think that it is a huge issue, but I think for us, I think in the UK, it's not as bad as it could be.
I've got a little sort of hobby horse that I jump on with the pre-season tours, and the number of games that are now being included on the annual calendar post-season tours. We're seeing clubs going away straight at the end of the Premier League season for commercial reasons. Club World Cup. Long term, what impact do you think that is going to have on players, and what are we going to see as a result of those games being included?
Yeah, I mean, it depends if we're gonna give players that break they need between seasons. I think it's very difficult to have to understand how bad that might be over the course of a career. I think if you're those types of players that we've talked about from like in Madrid, I think it was Carvajal who is on par or on sort of trajectory to have quite a long-term chronic exposure to competition and training stress, in with included some of the travel pieces. I think that's a huge factor. I think it's just one thing that's going to add another layer of stress and even add more stress to the current training competition demand that currently happens. So I think another example would be, I think we're coming up to this sort of next international period, and for us, we had a few South Americans, and we had a rule, or there was a kind of a rule that the South Americans, when they came back, and if we were playing on like the Saturday, they weren't even considered. And then I think there was a time when like there was a bit more of a need, and it was actually Chicharito. So he'd been in South America. He came back on a Friday. I think we were playing the Saturday lunchtime. So that's kind of like a severe.
Wow.
So they're kind of he's probably playing Thursday our time, and then he's traveling back. And so this is where we kind of we put all this work into monitoring recovery and understanding where players are. This is the ultimate test. And so there were times when we were like, actually, you know what? Whether it was what he'd done in the game, how he travelled, his own travel routine, and also the recovery that he'd done once he got back to the UK, that actually at this point in time, it'd be reasonable that the player was ready to perform and play at least some part of the game. So there was times where it was the opposite as well. And again, those are the real tricky and nuanced and very delicate discussions and decisions that are being made. But also, I think listening to the player. So I also worked with Chicharito for the lead up to the World Cup in Russia in 2018. And a large part of my role there was to strategically decide how we would travel as a team, because they were going to be in Mexico for a bit, go to the US, and then move across to Europe and then to Russia. And some of those players who are playing in the Premier League, who are doing this they're doing it often, they're coming back and forth, they're probably the best people to ask about how to travel. And that's another thing for us. Like, we need to ask these people. And at the time, I remember he said that one of his strategies was to to create sleepiness. He didn't say it like that, but he was like, I'm just going to make sure when I get on that flight that I'm going to be so knackered and sleepy that I'm going to sleep through. So that's also something that we probably don't think about much, but it's something we need to get the information from the players and start working a framework around that.
I was actually talking to someone about something I did one of the last times I went to America. So I spend a lot of time out in the States myself, and I got up at 3 a.m, went for a run, came downstairs, got back in, and it was the morning that Canelo was fighting Crawford. So I sat up, watched that, went to the airport, I was shattered getting on the plane, and I thought, perfect, couple of sleeping gummies, and I was out. And as soon as I got to America, I was like, good to go. Absolutely fine, no problem. And I think it's just trial and error more than anything to make sure that you're hitting that time zone. And like you say, the more that you can do things and ask the people who do it often. And the reason I did it was because I remember speaking to a guy who was back and forth all the time. And I just got chatting to him on a flight. And he was like, oh, yeah, just get up dead early, make myself tired, have a sleeping tablet, get there, job done.
Well, we've got a player on now, or a former player. What did you like to do, Warnie, when we were recovering, in terms of like what protocols did you enjoy and what worked for you?
Loved the day off the next day. Yeah, to be honest with you, I was always one of them where I was very conscious, and this is something that I was going to ask Robin in a bit, was like going out. I didn't want to go out because I knew the day after or the day after that I couldn't move. I was absolutely done in. So I like to have a massage. I like to try and recover as much as possible. You give us our little sachet, your little bag of treats to take away to recover. But yeah, I think it was more just the massage was the most important thing. And I absolutely loved an ice bath. And that sounds really weird. And then later on in my career, when they started to bring in the cryo chambers, I loved the cryo chamber because I felt like I used to get a book into a cryo chamber on a Friday afternoon, and I was zonked going to bed that night. I had the best night's sleeps off a cryo chamber, which was one of the best things I had. So yeah, off the back of that discussion, Robin, alcohol.
Well,
what does it do?
Yeah. Well,
or what doesn't it do?
So going back onto the cryo, so you did that the day before the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting, because that's also something that we talked about. Like, well, you use that to indirectly improve your sleep. So it was a strategy. And again, And I think the day before a game, a lot of the work that I've been involved in, I think I lean more towards, unless like there's some real serious like fatigue from a muscular perspective, etc. Like making sure the players are doing what they think is going to help them. I think that is the perfect time to do that. Alcohol, yeah. Well, I mean, it's. I mean, number one, it's going to kill your sleep. So that's number one. And then, I mean, all the rest of the negative effects are pretty well known. From a recovery point of view, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to hear that you say that if you did go out or you consumed alcohol, like that is going to compound the initial negative effects of the game or the training. So yeah, it's not the most conducive strategy to recovering optimally if you're playing and training regularly.
Because I remember. Sorry, Lammy, I was just going to say about Sam Allardyce, where he used to say, didn't he? He'd almost say to you as a team, listen, stay in for a couple of weeks. I'll let you know when you can go out. Yeah. And it was always when we had a gap of a games, or we'd been on a decent run, and he'd be like, right, go out and have a blowout now. That's the time you can, because he was so aware of it and knew that there were certain times where players do also need a little bit of a blowout as well because of the stress of things, a way of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think the social factors of being around teammates, staff, and being able to kind of let your hair down, I think is obviously not spoken about that much. But I do think experientially it does have a positive effect. And you never know, it may also have a positive effect as some of that kind of long-term or like nervous system type discussion that we've spoken about. I think in professional football, I think that the main question is being very smart about when you do it. And I think like there were also discussions around, okay, when is the best time to put the Christmas do in, whether or not they happen anymore. But I think that should be a kind of in a weird way a very much like, this is a performance decision, right? When is the best time? We think this is culturally, it's tradition, it's good from that perspective. But when is the best time if it's going to happen?
Well, going back to that sleep conversation that we were having, there are players that will use alcohol as a means of getting themselves to sleep. Have you ever done any sort of education pieces with players around that, or how do you sort of, away from the social aspect, from the more sort of performance aspect of players using alcohol as a means of getting themselves to sleep? How do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, those are questions that have come up, and even I remember sort of players, and nothing to do with me, but asking different managers, are we allowed to have a glass of wine after a game and all this sort of stuff if we're away in Europe and stuff. So I think it's ensuring that you don't kind of teeter over the edge. I mean, I don't think any amount of alcohol is going to have a positive effect on sleep. I think that's probably got to be stated. It might make you perceive that you fall asleep quicker, but it does really disrupt the quality of that sleep. So I think you got to proceed with caution. And again, if it's going to happen and it's a Christmas do, or okay, well, if it's going to happen, well, when's the best time to put this in? I think that's the best way. I remember actually just talking about that. I remember there was one sort of Christmas do, and like the staff had kind of theirs on the same night, and somehow we kind of ended up in the same pub along the way. But me and a couple of the other staff, like, we'd given the players like all the hydration sort of kits and bags and stuff. And I don't remember that the old Powerade sachets, which was the powder. And so like some of the lads have had them, and they're just like pouring them in our pints and stuff. So it was it didn't work very well, the education piece there. But that's it's an interesting topic to try and educate the players on that side.
Yeah, we had Dr. Chris Rosimus on. I don't know if you know Chris from the FA, and we were talking to him about nutrition because that was his specialist field. And we had Dave Pyle on, who was one of the FA chefs, and just to talk about and continue the discussion on nutrition is just how important the food groups are that you can eat before and after games for recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's moved on as well now, where we talked about like the individual demand of players and what players may be doing in a game. And I think one of the key parts that we're working on at the moment is really raising awareness of periodizing that nutrition. So selecting that nutrition and those sort of key, whether it's carbohydrate, protein, fats, etc., based on what you've done in a game or in training, and also how that may change across the season. I think that's a huge factor, and I think it's probably advancing at a more optimal rate than, say, recovery strategies is alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even when it comes to those kind of pillars of recovery, if we're trying to reduce that inflammatory response, so that muscle damage response post-game, there's also some nutritional factors and like antioxidant and sort of anti-inflammatory foods and supplements that can also be used around those game times, and also like loading it across the season as well, which can be used to really individualize the recovery. When we started this project, we would, on a recovery day, so the day after a game, we would split players up into like whether or not we thought through some of the monitoring they had this structural damage, so there was like muscle damage, and whether or not it was more metabolic based fatigue. And based off that, we would also change what nutrition shake they would have. So if you have muscle damage and we want to reduce that inflammation, we would try and do that from a nutritional perspective with polyphenols or antioxidants, etc. And then on the flip side, if there wasn't this structural damage, we would want to actually try and increase blood flow as much as possible. So we would also use nitrates, so like beetroot juice and things like that, or different supplements to try and also stimulate blood flow. So we were trying to, our main thing was, what is the outcome for this player right now? And make sure we're integrating every piece of that performance and medical puzzle around it. So this is the one thing about recovery strategies. The kind of issue that we see now is that you got players who are potentially doing everything at their disposal. And so some of these things are probably contraindicative. So if you're going to go in an ice bath and you're going to cool the muscle down, and then maybe you have a massage after it, well, that massage actually might, through the friction, increase the muscle tissue temperature. So is there a better way of sequencing those two modalities if the player likes to do it and also it matches with what we're trying to achieve? So like, this is where I think the area of recovery in football can be very, very sophisticated, and all these things have to be understood as well.
Yeah, I just think it's fascinating, because one of the other things that I'm seeing at the moment is obviously social media is having a huge impact, where people are talking about this food does this food does this. And I often think, do the players or any of the players look at that and come to you and go, oh, I should be eating this? And you're thinking, no, you shouldn't. And you think, who are you listening to? And we had this discussion a few weeks back about people outside of football who are trying to coach players. And I feel like there's outside influences now that players might be listening to who aren't necessarily sort of educated as much as they think they are. And is that a massive problem as well?
Massive, massive problem. And I think
there's a huge exhale there, Robin.
I mean, yeah, from a recovery perspective, I mean, it is in general. Lammy, we've discussed this in the past, and I think back in the day, like it was only really the club staff were involved. There might be an external psychologist because of players not wanting to kind of provide that sort of information. But yeah, I think now it's when it first started happening 15 years ago, where there was external people coming involved, it was a bit like, oh, this is new, and like how could this ever work? But then you have to learn to work with those staff.
Yeah.
And a large portion of my role when I was with Red Bull was to be completely transparent and collaborative. If we had footballers who came, or I worked with them as part of my role, it's like, no, we're going to share all the information. We're going to execute the club's training program. We'll adapt when needed. So there has to be this transparency, but whether or not that happens across the board, I'm probably doubtful. But in terms of like information like players come up with, I think that if we talk about recovery, there's been a huge increase in the number of tools, modalities, strategies that are available.
Yeah.
And there's not been an increase in the knowledge of how to use them appropriately. And now, again, like I always kind of would split players into two profiles. You'd have one, the most professional player, training ground as long as they could be there for, would do everything, cycling around the different modalities. Top professional. And you have the other one who was like, right, one modality for all occasions. So muscle soreness, massage. I've got a concussion, massage. Like it was like it was their thing, which both profiles like are great, but there's definitely that's definitely not the optimal way to do it. Because again, if you're going to do an ice bath and a massage, you're probably going to reduce the effectiveness of that ice bath.
Right.
So yeah. And it's getting worse now, I think, because of all this information, whether it's through influencers, content creators, people who aren't necessarily educated and have expertise in these things. And now we're in this like moment of additive, like let's add things. And I keep hearing this word stacking, and it's like, just stacking things. Like, and I think the danger I see is players now are getting more anxiety around they've not done this recovery modality they think makes a huge impact for them. And so that for me is a real problem. Like you're adding stress, you're adding anxiety because of something that they think should help them, but they don't really know. And they're probably also taking away time from actually training and doing things that can impact their performance. So yeah, I think it's a bit like the Wild West at the moment.
You mentioned earlier on, Robin, the importance of putting players at the centre of that information gathering and actually asking them. In terms of delivering recovery protocols, have you moved away from allowing the players to choose or self-select their own recovery modalities and become a little bit more prescriptive in the work that you want the players to do?
A balance. So I think that, like Stephen mentioned, like he understands what he knows helps him. So it's how you harness that kind of preference with the context of what's going on and what we can also like prescribe that we know will maybe change from the physiology. So it's how you balance the two. So it's never a case of stripping anything out. And this was a thing like back when I started at Manchester United, I had people like Ryan Giggs, very, very astute and very well developed a recovery process for himself. And there was no way like you're going to go in and start changing that. But it was always like, be curious of why they do it, what they think it's doing, and then starting to add that kind of subjective objectivity and get that data and actually show, well, actually, maybe like if you place your massage at this point in time post game, you might actually get more benefit. And that's what we did. Like we didn't change and it wouldn't take anything away. We actually just changed some of the timing and the sequencing of some of those modalities that he would do. And then we were able to show him that there's a objective, positive response here. So that was always kind of my approach when it came to doing that, because we would come across also players like Bastian Schweinsteiger, like World Cup winner. Like it would be wrong for me to say, well, actually, no, do this. It was about, right, let's work together and see how this can be developed.
I think there's an interesting point in that where footballers are creatures of habit, but they're also very superstitious as well. So I used to always, when we had a game, I'd be the first one on the treatment table, getting a massage straight away after, because I always thought the quicker I can get on that massage bed the day before a game and get ready for the next day to recover, in my head it was psychological. Might not have mattered what time I was doing it, but again, it was a psychological thing. But the only thing I look back on now and think is, I wish I'd have learned more about this, because I think I was probably a little bit stuck in my ways. And if I'd have been more adaptable and more understanding of why things were put on, or why you could change things and how it'd help improve, I think it'd have helped me massively.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just don't think there's still a lot of unknowns in this area. And I think goes back to one of the original points that we discussed. Like, have we put the resources into this, and are people actually giving it the respect it should have? And I think there's definitely some teams out there who are doing some things really well around monitoring recovery and then prescribing based off what that system they're trying to recover, and not just kind of aimlessly prescribing. But there's also a lot of teams out there who just, right, players do what you want. And I think that's a little bit of a disservice to the players, because we wouldn't allow them to do what training they wanted to do. So why do we think that from a recovery perspective, it's kind of, just do what you want. So I think it's how you balance it, how you harness that belief effect, and just more sequencing and less stacking and adding things to the system. So because there's a lot of tools that are proposed to do certain things, and they really don't, and it's the Wild West. But I think the other thing that we see often in like the recovery point systems, so on a recovery day, it's like we create these frameworks, and each modality is a certain point number, and you're asking players to like get as many points as you can. And although I like the concept of kind of incentivizing as such, if it could be seen that way, of getting players to do X, Y, Z, I still think that's suboptimal unless you do a point system which is still like targeted of what you're trying to do. Like if from my perspective, if you've played, Stephen, and you've done X amount of high intensity and sprint distance, and you're feeling sore the next day, and we know you've got structural damage, if we're not asking you to do cold water immersion as soon as possible, I think that's a disservice to you as a professional. We know that's going to help. So I think it's give you that recommendation, provide the resources, but then how do we then sequence him? Well,
I think society's changing a lot now. I don't think I think people are more conscious about keeping fit, and there's a lot of like high roxes and CrossFit events now. Just for the people who are listening who are non-athletes, what sort of advice would you give to them for recovery?
Yeah, I think the first piece of advice is understand, I think, the context. And the first question should be, do you even need to recover? Because one thing we've not talked about, which we probably should have spoken about at the start, is around recovery and adaptation. So they both live on the same sort of continuum. So if you're trying to get fitter in pre-season, we are trying to stress those physiological systems as much as possible. So we can also use some of these tools to increase some of those fitness gains. So if you've done a training session in pre-season, like adding certain heating modalities, whether it's hot tubs now and saunas, they can actually increase the stress and increase the fitness gains. So I think it's really important now that recovery is not just seen as, well, what do we do just to return back to this functional state? It should be, well, what can we actually do to increase fitness and be really sophisticated? I do think that nowadays you have an activation session or you have a precursor to training every day. Like there's always something you got to do in the gym or out on the pitch. But I think in the next few years, the future is going to be, well, there's always going to be some sort of intervention after training that's going to be context determined. So back to your actual question around understanding context, do I need to recover? Well, yes. Okay. I need to do X, Y, Z to recover structural damage, for example. If I don't, if it's pre-season or you've got a couple of days off, well, actually, let's try and stress the system a little bit more or add factors to enhance some of the responses that we'd get. So context is the key thing. I think that it's not always, I think if you're a weekend warrior or you're a non-professional athlete, I think it's maybe more about adaptation than it is recovery. So
I just wanted to ask one about, you mentioned right at the very beginning of this conversation about the increase in staff numbers and staff members. Do increases in sports scientists, increases in coaching staff, increases in physiotherapists means there's more opinions? Does that make delivery of recovery protocols more difficult, in your opinion, because there are communication gaps potentially? Who actually makes the decisions?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I'd probably have a different answer for you depending on which. If we take the Man United days, for example, which head coach or which manager was involved at the time. I mean, from my perspective, we started that project and process in 2009, and we had huge success under Sir Alex Ferguson. But even one thing that really helped me after that was also David Moyes. He would rate the players from a performance perspective subjectively, because in football it's very difficult to get objective performance markers. We're trying to, so that gave me a bit of an anchor point of, well, I'm monitoring the recovery, and we're trying to really validate how sensitive these recovery markers may be in the lead up to subsequent days, or subsequent games. Sorry, so that really helped from kind of, you talked about opinion, about trying to find some subjective performance marker and then start to correlate that with what we were seeing on how players would recover. So that was really impactful for me, and I think for our learning for the next 10, 15 years in that space. And then Lou Van Gaal was probably one of the most impactful for me personally, and also in this. Like one of the stories when he came in, and this was an established process now, this area of recovery and the monitoring that we were doing. We'd even like redeveloped Carrington to provide a space specific to recovery monitoring, and it was like the recovery lounge. We wanted it to be less clinical, less lab testing. And he was like, what you're doing is great, keep doing it. And then never really was kind of bought into it as such. And it was probably about 3 months into the season, and we were playing a Monday night game, and we were on Sunday afternoon. So we were actually training late on because they wanted to train at the same time as we played. And it was just like he came to me and said, is anyone at risk for the game? And this system was never designed to be, this is an injury prediction process. But at the time, it'd been about 3 or 4 months, and the training was very different for the players at that time. So there was quite a lot of stress on the system. And so I was very confident in what we'd done and the information intelligence that we'd gleaned. So I kind of hung my hat on a response to the gaffer at that point. I said, I think this player's at a risk. 15 minutes into the game on that Monday night, there was a muscle injury. And so the next day we're in for training, and he just came to me, he winked at me, said, "You were right." And then stood me up in front of all the players and said, "Robin's been telling me this information over the last sort of few months. We've been evaluating it." And he actually said, well, everything he said has been proven to be right, which wasn't the case, but it was his way of being like to the players, this information is really important. And that was a real impact for me, because it was like in front of all the players, and there was like this kind of moment. But then it almost changed how I had to then work with the players, because then they saw me more of a like, you've got a real important role here for the manager. And so that was something I had to navigate. And there was times where there was players that like wouldn't be in a team selection, and this information was used for that. It was never designed to be, but it was real. We'd done so much work with it, and it was PhD kind of standard. It was no, we weren't cutting corners. And so there were times where you had to face up a player who said, I've just been told that I'm not in the squad, and why not? So kind of it gave me like, right, I've got to be able to be very delicate and things like that with those conversations. And there was things that I made massive mistakes. I remember a player, very high profile player, who we'd monitored things, and like he came on for 20 minutes in a game, took a corner, tore his quad, and the next day I was like, oh yeah, like we saw some indicators, and he's like, well, why did you do something? Yeah, so that was where you kind of you really grow up, and you kind of understand the responsibility you have, and again, we would never have got to that level if it wasn't through. This was like 5 years down the line, so it was a long process. But then there's other great examples where I know you had Steve on a few episodes ago. And
Dr. McNally.
And there was a time when we were doing this, and we were measuring HRV. We were doing it post exercise, so it was like what was the HRV reaction to exercise, and even like I remember Wazza was like, he'd go to the dock with telling the doc about his HRV score from the testing and like what we could do. And I was like, wait a minute, to get to a level where you've got a player like one of the best players of all time who is using that data to then try and get recommendations for himself. That's also a kind of an indication of the impact that we'd had. So
and also as well, knowing that you're going down the right path and people are buying into it and understand it, I suppose.
Yeah, no, and don't get me wrong, it was to get some of these players to do some of these things was not always the easiest. There was a few sort of nice altercations, let's say, but it was like I say, it was always born from, I think, having the respect from the management, and then whether it was Sir Alex or whether it was David Moyes, Louis van Gaal, showing like, listen, this is really important to what we're going to do. I think was a key bit, and yeah. And I think one thing that, just because I'm thinking about some of the different managers, like for Jose as well, I remember like another learning curve for me. So we'd lost, I think we lost at West Ham away, and we were in the next morning for the recovery session. And I mean, I can't remember how many recovery sessions I delivered between 2009 and 19, but I used to, like, when you'd lost, one of the worst jobs probably in the training round to deliver a recovery session. No one wanted to be there. Everyone was pissed off. So for me, it was like, outcome. This is what I need to achieve. This is why we're here. So how do I best get this outcome in the shortest period of time? And we did. But then a couple of players, like, they'd finished the recovery session, they were heading out. But hearing the exhausts, like, cruising out the training ground. And so, like, Jose came in and was like, well, where have they gone? They're doing a recovery session. And I was like, oh, well, we've finished. And it was like, he was like, and obviously it was a great learning curve for me, because I was like, well, in my mind, I was like, this is the outcome we're trying to achieve. But it wasn't about the outcome. It was about, no, we're in, and we're going to do everything we can to recover, and whatever that takes. That might not be the most scientific sort of perspective, but it didn't need to be. And so, yeah, it was another good kind of learning curve to me, to kind of also get your head out of the weeds sometimes, and sort of like, well, there's also a social impact, there's a team aspect to this. And that would be why a lot of the recovery sessions that we would deliver, like, they would start with the team together, and that was an important piece. Like, everyone, like, they would do their individual bits after the first part, where they'd all be on the bikes, and it wasn't about like cycling, it was just about increasing range of motion, ankle, knee and hip, getting them together. We might be looking at something on the screen, etc. Then it would be then, as a team, some sort of mobility, which everyone kind of needed. You'd get stiff joints, lower back particularly, but at that point it was like individualized completely. So, but it's that understanding that there's more to just this session, this day, than the outcome. Yeah, that's nearly 10 years of doing that session, and yeah, it probably did change over the years. And I remember, like, the likes of Gary Neville, Rio, Scholes, like, how professional, and there was a real kind of intention and sort of deliberateness of that session. But then you have younger athletes come through and personalities change. And I remember one time, like, there'd be a few players would like laugh or smile, and we'd just lost the day before. I was like, wait a minute, like, you can't do that. So almost seeing the difference between the professionalism of those players, where if we'd lost with that core group, this was about, like, doing everything right, and not to say the others didn't, but there was just that change in type of player and type of personality, which was also something I would notice over the years. So yeah,
brilliant. Right. Well, one thing we try and do on Strain of the Game is get the best people in the field. And Robin, you are obviously one of those people. And just for anyone who's listening or sort of watching on YouTube, where can they follow your work if they want to learn a little bit more?
Yeah. So Instagram, LinkedIn. I try and post as much as I can. I don't post a lot. But yeah.
Too busy.
Well, yeah, maybe sometimes. But yeah, so I like, trying to particularly sort of keep doing some good work around this area, and also trying to sort of find a bit of an intersection between sort of performance and what's really needed to take it further, and kind of not getting stuck in the weeds as sometimes sports science can do. So yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's been another episode of Strain on the Game. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow, like, and leave a review. Also subscribe. It does make a big difference. See you next week. Follow us on social media and YouTube at Strain on the Game. Subscribe, like, and follow.